Coming up on this week's show, a legendary fighter arrives on the 3DO.
Run your entire PS2 library from a memory card.
And we chat with Harvey Smith about the origins of immersive sims.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each and every week with our incredible friends, our sponsor Bitmap Books. Now, one of their best books you need to check out. I'm Too Young to Die, the ultimate guide to first-person shooters, covering the years 1992 to 2002 and celebrating more than 180 games. All the big ones are in there: Doom, Quake, Half-Life, Deus Ex, and of course we're going to be talking about this week's interview, GoldenEye 007, the Halo games are in there too, so you've got to check this out. An incredible book celebrating the biggest genre in gaming and weighing in at more than 420 pages. You can check it out and the rest of their retro gaming collection at bitmapbooks.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 466, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to the show. In fact, our first episode of February, I did say that on last week's podcast, it came out on January 31st, which a few people pointed out in the YouTube comments. Thank you for that. But of course, first podcast of the month, and I think we should maybe give the virtual birthday bumps to our lad Ravi Joe.
Let's beat him up.
Yeah.
We'd have to give him a lot of bumps though, won't we?
Yeah.
That's young Joe talking.
The big 4-0 this week, Ravi.
Yeah, I'm as old as Amiga.
Yep.
I'm not going yellow. I don't need to get my capacitors replaced yet. But they are bulging.
Maybe after your birthday party next weekend, Ravi. That could be your present. But yeah, welcome to 40s Club. It's not all that painful, is it?
No, and I reckon there's a lot of listeners here that are going, young man.
Yep.
40s.
You'll get there soon, Joe. Don't worry. It goes
I'm not
fast.
far off.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, this week we have got, of course, lots of news stories to get through and an incredible guest on the podcast as well. And Ravi and I have actually just recorded this interview, like literally just finished it a few minutes ago before we're doing the news. I've got to say, we crammed a hell of a lot into an hour with Harvey Smith. Some incredible stories in this interview.
Yeah, it was a really interesting interview. You know, a lot of you might know Harvey Smith from Arcane Studios as well. So Dishonored, which is just a absolutely fantastic game, and Prey as well. You know, he's been involved in a lot, and it all kind of roots back to the origins of, you know, immersive sims and history of like D&D as well, and Dungeons and Dragons and Ultima, and of course, you know, Harvey talks about System Shock, which was one of the first titles he kind of was leading on and worked on. But before, he was a QA assessor for Origin Systems, and he was doing, you know, Super Wing Commander as well, which we're all big fans of Wing Commander here as well. And there's some good stories about that and Origin. But then, of course, Deus Ex. Some deep chat about that, which really did change things, you know, for first-person shooters as well. That kind of first-person shooter RPG world was pretty amazing, and we explore that and the kind of ideas behind it and the roots within System Shock as well.
Even the journey of how he got into the industry is just incredible. Which I won't give any spoilers, but yeah, it's like nothing we've heard before. A really interesting route into the industry. So you're going to really enjoy this week's guest, Harvey Smith. He's coming up on the show in around half an hour from now. But of course, you know the way the podcast works. First 30 minutes is when we geek out about what's been happening in the world of retro gaming and technology from over the last 7 days. Has been a busy week now. I think kind of the early, first couple of weeks of the year always get a bit of a lull, but it just kind of feel like a lot has been happening over the last week, including this, that we did actually cover this story all the way back in September of 2023. And that is that a group of fans were porting Mortal Kombat 2 to the much maligned 3DO console. Now, I remember when we first covered that story, there was a basic like little teaser on YouTube.
It was a little tech demo, wasn't it?
Yeah, pretty much. And the big news this week is that now it's been finished and there is actually a release candidate out there for people to play. Now, I think out of us guys, I'm the only one with a 3DO in my collection, right? You guys haven't got 3DOs.
No. Only an emulator.
Yeah, much experience with them? Have you ever played a fighting game on the 3DO before?
No, was it Katsumi Ninja, or was that
That was on the Jaguar.
Atari Jaguar, yeah.
Although in many people's minds, those two systems do kind of get lumped in together because of obviously the era that they came out, that weird time between like the Mega Drive, Super Nintendo, and the PlayStation coming out, those kind of consoles that, you know, quickly came and went. There were actually a few decent fighters on there. Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. There's a really good version of that on the 3DO. Rise of the Robots, probably the best version of that game. I know that's not saying much, but it does have, you know, probably the smoothest graphics, apart from the PC version, if you want a console version of Rise of the Robots. Had like Primal Rage on there as well. There's a game on there called Samurai Showdown, Way of the Warrior. So it did have, you know, a few fighters back in the day. And Mortal Kombat 2 wasn't a game that made it onto the 3DO originally because, you know, I think they looked at the sales of it and, you know, because that was a ridiculously expensive console when it came out. I think like $600 or something it came out in the US. So it wasn't a console that I had much experience with at the time. But this is really cool now that you can download a release candidate demo of Mortal Kombat 2, which is just about ready to go. Now, have you guys watched the, I assume you haven't downloaded the ROMs not having 3DOs, and this is on my to-play list this weekend. I'm going to get the 3DO set up and have a go at it. But have you guys watched the gameplay demo? There's like a 40-minute kind of long play of it on the 3DO, and I'm curious to know what you think.
So I've watched, there's a YouTuber called Sega Lord X.
Yeah.
Who originally covered just Sega stuff, but now he's branched out. Now he's got quite a large following. And I watched his video on it the other day. And there was kind of like 3 kind of like takeaways for me with it. So don't get me wrong, it looks really good. And it's really interesting to see with a bit of kind of like time and experience with the 3DO what you could actually get it to do. You know, it was a powerhouse, he explains. You know, it's just, unfortunately, it just didn't have some very good games on it. But as you just mentioned, Street Fighter 2 Turbo was a fantastic version. And from the looks of things, obviously I haven't felt it and played it, this version of Mortal Kombat 2 looks really good as well. But my 3 kind of takeaways was, 1, the sprites are massive on it. And they're really, really detailed. And at first I was like, that's really cool. Like, look at that amount of detail. But then I was a bit like, is it a bit too kind of like zoomed in? Like, it, you know, I wasn't sure. If anything, it actually they look bigger than the arcade version in my mind's eye.
Yeah, they are. It's the same sprites. So he's literally just imported the arcade sprites and I think, you know, kind of touched them up or, you know, kind of re-imported them, maybe changed the colour palette slightly to match the 3DO. But yeah, the arcade sprites, but I think it's just because the 3DO uses different screen resolutions.
Right.
It looks like it's zoomed in a bit closer. But yeah, I do agree. It looks like the play feels a bit tighter than the arcade.
Yeah, everything is a little bit tighter. But, you know, the detail and the graphics are there. Then my other one that I wondered was, because it's very, you know, like for like, is obviously the original arcade version of Mortal Kombat 2 famously, I kind of had like it predicted it knew what you were about to do, so it'd block you and stuff. It was it ate your coins. It made you spend a lot of money.
Had good AI basically.
You could argue if it was good or if it was bad, but yeah, like it would block your attacks and everything. Like everything was like, there was like not a delay. It's hard to describe. Hopefully a lot of people know what I'm on about. Like it would know you were about to throw a kick, you know, like what kick you were doing. It just block it, like, you know, the AI in it. I was curious to see whether that was still kind of present in this version, with it being a port of the arcade version, but he didn't mention it. And he gets through it, like, and he completes it, which was quite interesting. And then the third thing I was wondering was, could Shang Tsung morph into anybody in the game while playing him? Because of, in all the different ports of like Mortal Kombat 2 and Mortal Kombat 3, depending what console you played it on, there'd be like different restrictions to him. Like the game would have to load like halfway through a fight if he changed into somebody, or he could only morph into like 3 different, like the ninjas, for example, like different palette spots. At the time of watching it last week, the Sega Log Arts video, he said that Shang Tsung could only morph into the person he was fighting against. So they haven't.
It was like that on the Amiga as well, if I recall. Yeah.
So they haven't quite worked that one out. I'm not too sure if they have since, but that was like my free kind of like, okay, what does it look like? What can Shang Tsung do? And then, but graphically and the gameplay of it looks great. But what was really interesting is he said like it doesn't feel arcade perfect, but it doesn't feel like any other version of Mortal Kombat 2 either. So he was.
That's a good thing for me though, because it's like you know I could play the arcade original on MAME, but I think part of the appeal of having home ports is there are slight differences that are only playable on that system, which I think as long as it doesn't detract from the game or make it worse, it's all right if it's different. I think.
Is there any copy protection on the 3DO?
No, you just burn discs.
So just burn it. Nice.
Yeah. Some CD burners cost like 50 grand or something back then. CDs are never going to be pirated.
But yeah, he pretty much ends the video saying, to the developers of this, make it its own thing. Don't try and make it arcade perfect.
I agree.
Make it Mortal Kombat 2 3DO version. Make it its own unique version of the game and kind of like embrace that it feels a bit different, because he was like, it doesn't feel bad. It feels good. He was like, it's a really good version of Mortal Kombat 2, which was really cool. I think I like Mortal Kombat 2, but for me, it's Mortal Kombat 3. You've got all the characters in 3, so that would have been really cool to see. But overall, I think it's wicked.
There is one great little Easter egg in there as well. I'm not sure if you guys have seen it. If you've got like the Mortal Kombat 2 on 3DO release candidate gameplay video handy, which is at the top of the article, I'll link in the show notes. If you skip around 9 minutes 14 into the video, you'll see, literally I was watching this earlier while I was eating, I nearly spat my food out. For those that haven't watched the video,
I've just seen it.
Well, in the original, obviously, you've got Dan Forden, who is the toasty guy.
Yeah.
In this, Trip Hawkins pops up in the corner as a toasty guy. Yeah.
Smart.
Yeah.
Obviously, the guy behind 3DO and Electronic Arts.
Brilliant touch, that is.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that. That made me laugh out loud when I saw that. So hope he keeps that in the final version. But as someone who I played Mortal Kombat 2 all the time on the Amiga back in the day, and I did see a little bit of discussion in our Discord, Ravi, the other day after you give Mortal Kombat Amiga a bit of a slagging.
Maybe I need to give it more of a chance. Yeah, I was like, it isn't as good, and you know what it was? It was the control system for me. I could never master it with that one button, but apparently it was quite decent.
Yeah, I always liked it on the Amiga. Obviously played the arcade whenever I went to, the seaside back in the day. But to me, the look of this, like you said, the resolution differences aside, I think it looks arcade perfect. Like you said, there's slight differences in gameplay. There's a couple of things I noticed, for example, at the moment when they do the fatalities, in the arcade version, the screen kind of darkens in the background, which doesn't happen in this version, but, minor differences like that. But I think, this is, the fact that 3DO is just getting some love, and, massive games like this are being ported to it, I think, for, in terms of what a big deal this is for the 3DO homebrew community. And I'm hoping this is like a start of things to come, because we talk about it all the time, and we're going to talk about a new Dreamcast game in just a moment. It does feel like certain systems, which understandably do get a lot more love because, they sold more and, more people have got them. But I think, it's always nice when major titles like this, if you owned a 3DO back in 1993, you would have been gutted that this game didn't come out on your system. So I think, for people that have maybe waited 30 odd years for it, it is nice to be able to play it on the 3DO at long last, and the fact that it is a really good port as well. So that is available for download for free. It is only a release candidate at the moment. Apparently there are still some changes he wants to make in the game as well, including some additional features he wants to get in there too, and even more optimizations as well. But it looks like it's running really good at the moment. So if you want to get hold of that, I'll link up the link to get that in this week's show notes. Now, speaking of innovation, this is really cool because it just seems like, there's so many different ways these days to play our retro gaming libraries. We kind of take it for granted now that you can load up massive hard drives or even SD cards with like every game ever made for a system and scroll through menus. You know, if we'd have had that like 20, 30 years ago, that would have been game changing. But this is really cool. This is a new system that allows you to run your entire PS2 library from a $50 memory card.
Yeah, this is absolutely bonkers. Like, you know, the PS2 is a system that you can really easily hack anyway with like a FreeMUP boot. But, you know, you'd have to have an external adapter as well and put a SATA drive in the back. This is like all in one. This is basically a micro SD card that's then put through the memory card port. And it also enables you to boot the games directly from the micro SD. It is using OPL, which is the Open PS2 loader, which is also used on a lot of the FreeMUP boot cards as well. So I think there must be some kind of system, you know, booting going on in there and soft modding. But the kind of idea of this is that you can just go up to a machine, plug it in, boom, you've got all your titles. And I was always wondering about the loading speed. Is there going to be any issues? Because I used to have something similar for the Dreamcast, and that would be done through the port at the back. But apparently the memory card reads at a really good speed.
Yeah, there's been a bit of debate about this. I've seen some people saying it will be slower and maybe FMV games might stutter a bit. Other people are like, no, actually it's fine. Some people reckon it's around the same speed, if not maybe a little bit faster than the DVD drive. I mean, for me, obviously it depends kind of how the memory card kind of taps into the PlayStation 2's memory.
I guess it's just using it as like a device. So with OPL, we used to have, I think his name's Grim Doomer. There was a version that he released that supported different file formats. So before, you used to have like a SATA drive, connect it to your PC, and then you'd have to mount it and in this like special program that basically mounted it in like the PS2 readable format. But then he got one that did it, I think it was FAT32, and you could just like drag and drop the ISOs into there, which was really awesome. I guess this is just telling OPL, look, these files are available, but now via memory card. But also, interestingly, it looks like it still works as a memory card.
Yeah.
So
virtual memory card
you could have like 64 gig or whatever of, you know, saves on there if you really wanted to, even though they're absolutely tiny files. But yeah, it just seems like it's kind of become the storage medium, and it's fast as well because of that port.
Yeah, which for me, I mean, my PlayStation 2, God, I think I modded mine. I can't remember whether mine's actually got like a physical mod chip in it, maybe.
That's old school because, I just bought from Amazon FreeMUP boot and just put it in straight away.
Yeah, I've got that on one of my PlayStation 2s. I think the other one's got an actual like mod chip in there from, you know, the early 2000s. And I've got like an IDE hard drive in the back of it. I think it's only around like 80 gigabytes maybe, so I haven't got like every game on there. But the fact that now, I mean, just kind of how far things have come on, the fact that you can have something that can fit in the palm of your hand with like every PlayStation 2 game on there, that you don't have to mod the system as well, which is great. You know, no opening it up, no soldering, nothing like that, no removing the optical drive, which with a lot of these kind of, you know, optical drive emulators, we often have to take the optical drives out the system and stuff as well, don't you? Which
I think the only difference in this is going to be the PlayStation 2 games ISOs you can just drop on there.
Yeah.
Load them up. PS1, it's always very weird. You have to do it in this it's a format. It saves it as like a VCD. It's called Pop.
Right.
And there was a program called Pop Starter, and it is really hard to kind of get them running through the PS2. Even though PS2, you know, you could put the old disc in and then kind of run it. That would run a bit better, but it seems to have some issues loading PS1 games.
Right.
I've heard they don't run as well. I've never actually got it to work, so I don't know. I've always tried to like, you know, make ISO images in this format, and it's not really worked. So maybe they'll have some like better support for that as well, which could be interesting.
Yeah, it just seems a convenience factor of it as well for me. I mean, you know, rather than having, you know, trying to source a big hard disk to put in the back of your machine, or even trying to play it over that USB one port that's on the PS2 that is like so slow.
I think this is actually faster than the USB one.
100% will be. What do you think, though, Joe? Because, I mean, you've always been, out of all us guys, you're the guy that's probably the most traditional. You like to have your original discs for your systems. I don't think you've actually gone down the flashcart route for any console yet, have you?
Well, no, I haven't. So when I was a teenager, when I was a young boy, my friend Richard...
I play the Warburtons music now.
Yeah. He I can't remember what it's called, but had his PS2 modded, which he did himself, where it would boot up from the memory card. He had like a disc and it'd boot up from the memory card. And then he had a hard drive in the back of his PS2 and we could play, PS2 games off the hard drive, as well as like Super Nintendo and Mega Drive and stuff like that. So we used it, as an emulation machine. And that had pretty good load times, etc. But the amount of work that he had to put into it to get it to work was crazy. Like, it took him like a few nights of playing around with it and stuff.
Yeah.
And it didn't work on the Slim, obviously, because there wasn't a hard drive port. But to see this, kind of just like, working on the Slim and stuff, I know there's probably other things that work on the PS2 Slim, but I haven't seen them. So initially seeing this, I was like, okay, that's crazy. That's really cool. But I am very torn at the moment because I was talking to a fellow at work and he said to me the other day, I made a joke about like, my daughter inheriting all my collection when I die. And he was like, yeah, but when you die, nobody might be bothered about any of this stuff because they're all dead. And I was like, he's got a good
cheery outlook on your day, that.
And I was like, he's got a really good point. Like, maybe I need to sell it all and get all these flash drives on my console, all these other drives and stuff.
You just said then, your friend, took 3 nights doing it and like changing it. To me, those are 3 nights of heaven. And this kind of removes that, it just makes it so easy.
I kind of get what you're saying there because I often do that at a weekend. I'll be like, right, I've got an old PC in my office. I'll set it up with like an emulation. I'll make a great emulation box, and I'll get like an Amiga emulator running on there, and I'll load all the games up and everything. Then at the end of the weekend, I'm like, right, that's running great now.
Yeah,
put it away. Never use it again.
I understand that. I, for the first time in a very, very long time, dabbled in some soldering the other day, and I'm going to have a go at fixing Dan's Game Gear.
Good luck.
I fixed some Game Boy games, just replacing the batteries and just, cleaning up some stuff and fixing a few connections and stuff like that. And then I got a few Pokemon games in the post and expecting them not to work, and they all worked. And I was like, oh, I want them to be broken. Yeah. And I was like, okay, that's funny. Like, it was like a slight disappointment that I didn't have to fix them.
You need more things to solder around. Take the TV apart and have a bit of practice on it.
Yeah,
I've got a CRT, Joe, if you want to.
But yeah, it's cool. It's cool to see that. It depends how you look at it, but
yeah,
the fact that you don't have to mess around with it like that.
Yeah,
to some people would be really cool. To other people, it would be a bit like, oh, okay, that's no.
And to be honest, there's so many PS2s around as well.
Yeah,
I think this is cool. Just to it might get more people into retro systems, and we might see maybe a bit of PS2 homebrew kind of maybe games being targeted to that system again.
And one thing we didn't mention, which we should, is it actually works on the PlayStation 1 as well. Cool. Yeah. So yeah,
that's cool.
Really?
The Memcard Pro 2 for PS2 and PS1. Yeah, and UK price $39.98. So £40, which
crazy.
I think I'm going to get one of these right now because it's for that price. Yeah, a lot of messing around saved there. So I'll link up the website 8bitmods.com if you want to get hold of one in the UK. So it looks really cool. Now this next title looks a load of fun. I actually love these kind of games, but I know the one that this I imagine is inspired by because this is a new Dreamcast game. And this was for the recent Dreamcast Game Jam, Dream Disc 24, that happened over Christmas. And this is a game that's called Dream Ride. Now, looking at the video play of it, at the moment it's only kind of a beta version, a very minimal game. Work in progress, you could say. And it is free, if you want to get hold of it at the moment. And then a lot of the articles I've seen about it, they're calling it a Micro Machines style game. But to me, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking of skid marks.
you just see the cow.
Yeah.
And the way that the kind of cars are built as well. But
even the way
also,
they're rendered,
yeah, the way that they're rendered. That's what I was going to say. You know, like it looks like you've got ghost cars in there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does feel very, very like skid marks. Not set on a track though. It's kind of like an interesting kind of battle concept. Yeah.
Yeah. So it, like you say there, it's there's no track. It's just a grey area that you play on, and you can play it 4-player with 4 friends, or you can play it 8-player against the computer, so you and then 7 bots. But you just get arcade driving, which is I think you just drive around cones. Then you can get coin collecting, power up mode, arena battle, or mayhem. So there's all different modes in this grey area that you can play, which is quite interesting. And you mentioned the ghost car there. So that's if you're playing like the battle mode or the power up mode. There's different, pickups you can pick up like magnet, ghost, shield, boost, which is quite interesting. So I want to see this developed more.
Yeah.
And maybe see, kind of like the Micro Machines inspired kind of racing as well, but with those items and stuff implemented. But there definitely seems to be, obviously we talk every week at the moment about a new Dreamcast game, which is amazing, but there's definitely like the aesthetic of it, the way the cars are designed and stuff, and those kind of like early PS1, very late 16-bit kind of graphics.
Yeah.
It's definitely like, they seem really popular at the moment, like that, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but that car parking game that we covered last year as well.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah, like graphically, they're all very similar style, but I'm here for it. They remind me of like Micro Machines 3D and Micro Machines V4, and then obviously gameplay-wise, skid marks. But yeah, I'd love to see more development on this.
I mean, there is, if you go to the itch page for it, at the moment it's a free download. He's saying that future versions of it will be paid, which, fair enough. He's put a lot of work into this. It's a guy called Matt Sefton who's behind it. There are comments on the page as well. The one that most people are asking for is, they'd like the game to be developed more into, having actual tracks.
Yeah.
And other environments as well to give it different vibes.
Speedboats would be fun, wouldn't they? If they were going down the kind of Micro Machines route, yeah.
Yeah, but he said, absolutely agree, I'm working on it. So it looks like there is going to be, more to the game and hopefully some more environments. Because I think that's the only thing. I think, the sprites of the cars, they look to me like directly out of skid marks, super skid marks. And the fact the cow's there on wheels as well, which was in skid marks back in the day. But I think it looks just a little bit sparse otherwise. So I think it could definitely do with a more fleshed out environment. But I think in terms of the gameplay, looks like it could be a really fun multiplayer.
Maybe they could do online as well.
Which
would be interesting.
Yeah, Dreamcast Online these days is definitely a lot easier than it was, back in the day. So yeah, I think, I always enjoyed these kind of games. Never been all that good at skid marks. I always find it a little bit tricky to control. Don't know if you ever played that back in the day.
Really need to know the tracks. And you don't pick the cows because they're ridiculously fast.
Yeah, 100%. Load of secrets in there as well. CD audio, music, dynamic sound effects. Got a track mode in there too. Runs at 60 frames per second. So yeah, if you want a good bit of fun for your Dreamcast, apparently there's going to be a version of it for Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and Android as well. But at the moment you can download this for your original Dreamcast, burn it to a CD, or play it on an emulator as well. So if you want to check that out, I'll put that in this week's show notes. Now, we have been talking about FPGA consoles on the show in recent weeks. Does feel like every time we talk about a new FPGA system, the headline seems to be, there is an even cheaper one available now. And they are getting now to like almost impulse purchase prices, aren't they?
The prices are dropping massively, and this new one is pretty amazing. So we had the one coming from the guy that did the Mr. Pi, the new consoleized one. This is coming from the guys who do the Tang Nano FPGA, which was the tiny one that I might have mentioned before, which was, I think it was like 14 or 15 quid for the like smallest one, which is just crazy. And they're actually creating a console. So Tang stuff's usually available on AliExpress, sites like that. It's really interesting that they've actually got an FPGA console, because the price of it is absolutely ridiculous. I got really looking at, the Mister when that first came out, the price that you were able to buy that at. Wow. Compared to this is $69 for a system, which is the 60K version. They've also got 138K, but this has the cores for the NES, SNES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Mega Drive, Amiga, and the work in progress is the PSX, Neo Geo, NGPC, and the MSX as well.
Yeah, because it does seem from looking at the specs of it, it kind of makes sense that they're targeting those platforms. A lot of people are kind of saying that, it probably wouldn't support much after that.
Yeah, it's a low-powered FPGA compared to, and it's probably the size of the FPGA, but still, wow. It gives you that accuracy. It's FPGA, which is not emulation. It's... I can never know how to really put this.
Simulation, I think is what we normally say, isn't it?
That's how you say
simulation. Yeah, which I think, for the price, if you want something that's going to, again, the fact that you can have different cores on here, it can simulate many different systems, output to a modern display, and the whole device, it's tiny. It's only about the size of like a Raspberry Pi in a small case.
Yeah.
By the looks of it.
And you think how many machines that can replace, and people might not be able to, afford all the separate original ones, but they can get this and simulate loads of different machines.
Yeah, well, this is the company behind it called Sipeed. And they're saying, this is obviously, we're talking about it in terms of retro gaming, and they kind of position it as a bit of a Mr. rival. But it certainly can be used for other uses as well, including as a hobbyist computer.
That's where I originally saw it in my computer group. Someone turned up with one and said, "Look, this is really cheap on AliExpress. This Tang Nano, and it runs the Amiga core, and it was like Workbench 1.3 or one of the really early versions of Workbench, and it just didn't have that much RAM and stuff. But now they've added the PyStorm to it as well, and they're kind of doing developments on there as well. So." It's really interesting to see, and it is like a hobbyist thing, but these hobbyist boards kind of stemmed originally from the Raspberry Pi design, and then it's all kind of changed, and it's open source as well, which is pretty good to see.
So I've got all of the consoles that you mentioned, apart from, if this could do MSX and Neo Geo, then I'm interested. I think, having something that can run all those titles really well.
I've seen Vectrex on them as well.
So you need that display for the Vectrex there, don't you? It's got to be that Vector display. But if I'm in the sake of $70, I do think that's really cool. I love the fact that these FPGA systems are coming down in price. I think the only one I actually own is the Vampire V2 for the Amiga. I think it's the only FPGA system I've got, and I think that was about £250 when I bought that. Probably gone back about 10 years, so prices are definitely coming down. Yeah, so I think this looks definitely something to keep an eye on. So if you want to read more about that, I'll link that in the show notes along with all the rest of this week's stories. So we're going to be chatting to this week's special guest, Harvey Smith, getting some incredible stories about Origin Systems, Deus Ex, Area 51, System Shock, Super Wing Commander, all of that coming up on the show in just a moment. Quick reminder as well that if you do enjoy the podcast every Friday, we do have a Patreon that we hugely appreciate your support. We do a lot of little perks for our patron backers as well. We have a little exclusive area of Discord where we're chatting away all weekend there. We also have about 10-15 minutes of extra news stories on every single podcast. Of course, we chop the adverts out for the patrons, and we do our hangouts once a month as well. Basically, all patrons are invited to geek out with us for a couple of hours at the end of each month, and we're going to be recording another episode of our patrons exclusive podcast, The Retro Hour After Hours, in the next couple of weeks. So if you are backers on there now, you'll unlock that, and the previous 46 episodes of it as well.
It's crazy. You can subscribe to this RSS feed.
Yeah.
Basically, patrons exclusive one. It gives you the episodes early when we can release them early, and also ad free. But then you also get all the back catalogue. So that's tons and tons of listening.
Yeah, so really appreciate any support that we can get on there. So if you'd like to join our wonderful patrons community, all the details are at theretrohour.com. Right then, just before we hop into our chat with Harvey Smith in just a second, let's take a moment to give a huge thank you to a regular supporter of the Retro Hour. We love our mates at Shopify, you know them? The ones with that sound, the sound of making another sale. And we say this, I mean, we love having Shopify as a sponsor for this podcast because, we're actually customers of Shopify ourselves, which I think it's always important, isn't it, when we get sponsors into the podcast that we want to, what's the phrase? Eat your own dog food, I think is a rather unflattering phrase. Basically, we only want to get products on that we really believe in, and we've used Shopify ourselves. So we can vouch for just how incredible it is because we sell our books on Shopify.
Yeah, and it's such an easy thing to do. If you're not into web design, if you haven't got those kind of skills, setting up a store is amazing and really quick. You can also create an inventory as well. So you can have a stock of items that are already listed there and you can sell them digitally or online as well. Digital delivery of our PDF has been a really interesting thing as well. Yeah, I think it's great. And also the point of sale unit. So if you are actually out at a show or, you've got a little business going on, you're selling something, it's really good to have one of those point of sale units and have everything on there straight away and be able to take card payments.
Yeah, because no one carries cash, as we know it these days when you go to events. So, yeah, really useful. So whether you sell in person or online, maybe you've got a bit of a side hustle, you want to get a bit bigger this year, maybe you want to become your own boss in 2025, Shopify is the all-in-one commerce platform to start, run, and grow your business. And it's revolutionizing millions of businesses all around the world. And they've got all your sales channel covered, like we mentioned, online, no design or coding skills needed, those point-of-sale systems, even selling across your social media marketplaces like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, full of tools ready to ignite your growth and support you every step of the way. And also, they've got an incredible, award-winning, extensive business course library and support whenever you need it too. So it's time to get serious about selling. Why don't you give Shopify a try today? And of course, we've got you an incredible offer like we always try to do with our sponsors. So if you head to this link, shopify.co.uk/retrohour, all lowercase, I'll put it in the show notes as well. That will get you a £1 a month trial period. So if you sell anything at all, it's a no-brainer. Give that a go for just £1 a month. Head to shopify.co.uk/retrohour and get ready to take your business to the next level today and hear a lot more of this. Right, well, thank you for checking out the news this week. We'll have more for you on next Friday's podcast. And next, an incredible interview with this week's special guest, Harvey Smith, is next on the Retro Hour podcast.
So you're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and we're here today with Harvey Smith. And he was a lead designer on Deus Ex and Area 51 as well. Fireteam, which was a really interesting title. He started as a QA for Origin Systems and eventually got into titles like System Shock and also Super Wing Commander that was on the 3DO as well, which is a really interesting system to talk about. First, we always ask this question of our guest, Harvey, and that's what was your first gaming experience that really stood out to you or memory?
You're the first person to introduce me in 10 years that didn't mention Dishonored.
Yes,
but I see the focus.
For us.
Yeah, right. I see the focus here is way back. Yeah, it's funny. This is showing my age, but I remember when people around me, people with more money, started getting home entertainment systems like ColecoVision or the Atari. Which one was it? The early Atari, the first
2600?
Yeah. I have 1024, the ST stuck in my head. And, but no, the 2600. Yeah. Anyway, people started getting those up and down the block, or at least one friend out of 5 or 10 would have one of those, and we'd go over and play cartridge games. And at the same time, the grocery store at the sort of airlock into the grocery store. I don't know what it's like in Nottingham, but where I grew up on the Texas Gulf Coast, it's so hot and humid and there's so many bugs that all the grocery stores have 2 sets of doors, maybe 3 meters apart, so that one opens, you go in, it closes, the other one opens, you know, so that all the air conditioning doesn't get out. And that little space, often they would have like, you know, early video games, Defender, Berserk, Tempest, you know, eventually, like Phoenix, and eventually Dragon Slayer.
Yeah, some quality games there.
Yeah, Robotron was one of my favorite games, and like that, we had that, you know. So the town started to develop video games, and the mall, of course, but it all started for me with like somebody across the street getting a Pong, and we would just sit there like for hours playing virtual tennis, you know, like just this black screen, and you know, we could have gone on the street and played tennis. Or down at the school at the end of the block and played tennis. But like, there's something captivating about the power that you have, the agency that you have on a device, because, you know, you barely move your index finger and thumb. And, you know, theoretically your tennis player leaps across the court to block a shot or whatever. And it's, you know, you watch it even today with people discovering games, young people discovering games, like, you know, you could get out in the front yard and do all the rolling that you wanted to do, but it's instant in Elden Ring, and it makes you feel powerful somehow. And you can compress time. So, you know, a long trip happens in seconds, or climbing a mountain happens in seconds. I'm constantly struggling with like, why are video games so compelling? But anyway, somebody across the street got Pong, right? And then at some point a friend got an Atari 2600. And that was really like a magical time for me, because Adventure by Warren Robinett came out, and that was like the sort of formative game for me, because it's recombinant elements that are different every time you play. And the Bat is a great randomizer, and I've spoken about that before, or written about it, how that game was very formative for me. But even Battlezone, you know, where you could just drive in the distance. Like, there was this trick of like virtual first person traveling somewhere really worked well on me for some reason. And yet I wasn't really into flight sim. So it you know, it ended up being stuff on the ground for whatever reason. But yeah, that was a magical time, right? Because it was probably 1975 or something, or I don't know, 1976, somewhere right in that area. And if you think about, like, I'm definitely like, I feel like a poster child for Generation X. Yeah. So I love, you know, most of the music I love is like, you know, I was really into Joy Division and The Cure and things like that. I really like British pop. But I grew up around, you know, Kiss and, you know, Queen and things like that. And so that period of time, like, playing D&D for the first time and playing video games for the first time and coming of age in the mid 70s, or not coming of age, but like being a 10-year-old in the mid 70s. Yeah. It was pretty mind blowing. Right. And now when I look at how far it's gone, like, it's crazy. I know your focus is backward looking, but like, you know, you get a game nowadays and you're on your phone playing some crazy, deep, interesting game. Or you're listening to your friends talk about Dwarf Fortress or whatever, or PUBG. You're watching a video of your friends play PUBG, and it's just like, oh my God, I can't believe that happened. You know, so it's like, it's such a cool thing to watch this baton get passed, further and further afield, you know, as people figure out more to do with games.
So obviously, you know, you're playing games then, but when did you transition into being interested in programming and making games? How did that kind of happen?
Yeah, so I've always been like a writer, game designer, and small teams leader, and never a programmer. But so I kind of wish that I had people at the time pressuring me, like, you should learn to program. And because there were like, our school didn't have anything like that, but you could take a bus for half the day and go to a nearby school with more money, and if you qualified for this little program, you could get computer science in high school. But like, I would say that the first effort toward game design started when I played D&D, because I remember writing something that was meant to be like a different, you know, that's one of the magical things about tabletop role-playing games what band was it people said this about? Probably they've said it about many bands. Certainly the Velvet Underground and the Sex Pistols. Like very few people went to their shows, but everyone who did went home and started a band.
There was one gig, wasn't there? The Sex Pistols one in Manchester.
I mean, that's the story.
Those were formed, yeah.
Right. I've heard people attribute it also to the Velvet Underground. But anyway, it probably was the Sex Pistols. And I feel that way about tabletop RPG because many people just play the game, and that's lovely. And many people play the game because they like embodying a character and they can do voices and all that. But there is a certain category of person who plays it and immediately they want to go design a different version of it, right? I want to change it so that it's more Fae and elf focused, or I'm going to change it so it's less focused on that and it's more Dark Ages realistic history, or I want to change it so it's all dwarves getting drunk. And, like it just invites you to like go in a direction based on what you found intriguing and tweak some mechanics. I work closely with my friend Ricardo Bear, who worked with me. He came out of college. We hired him out of college on Deus Ex. It was his first project. Talk about a mind-blowing experience for a young professional. And, he's spent all the years working with me on different things. Like you alluded to Area 51. I didn't work on Area 51 for the PlayStation. I worked on Black Site, the sequel.
Yeah.
But which I don't feel like got enough time to bake properly, but whatever. It had more interesting ideas in it, I think. But in any case, Ricardo and I worked on that, and then we worked on Dishonored, and then he worked on Prey. I didn't work on Prey, but he and Raph did, and it's one of my favorite games of all time. But like, I remember meeting Ricardo, and he was big into D&D. We ended up playing together literally for decades now. But he was like, he had a version of the game. This is the same thing I did when I was like 11 or 12. But he had a version of the game that was more sophisticated, of course, and deeper than mine, because it was like his college years, where I don't remember what he called it. He had a name for the world and the system. He's very inventive. But he said, what I do in my system, it's very similar to D&D, but I let you roll 2 D20s and keep the higher or the lower, depending on what's going on. And I remember like us going, oh, that's kind of cool. And then like, of course, D&D eventually like went that way, and now he curses like, I did that first, but so everybody who plays, I think they walked away with the desire to make a game, and video games weren't initially like that for me because this is hard to describe. I've tried to describe it before, but when you grow up in a very blue collar town where everyone around you is a shrimper or a chemical plant worker, or they work at a liquor store or something like that, you don't, through osmosis, through culture, you don't like grow up thinking of people's parents as like doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs and playwrights, or, you just don't think of that. Like, I don't know why, but like books existed, and I didn't think really about people writing them for a living or whatever. And so, I didn't have a magazine subscription to some place in Silicon Valley that talked about the upcoming game or whatever. I have lots of friends who talk about that. Like Rafael Colantonio talks about that being a formative part of his experience in France because they felt so far away from everything that getting the American magazines made them feel, more connected to what was going on. But I had no awareness of that. And it was an epiphany later that like people make these for a living. I could have learned to do this or whatever,
I think that's really interesting because, like, playing D&D and tabletop games, I know you were a huge fan of Ultima Underworld as well, and a lot of the people that you ended up working with, worked on that title as well. How did kind of, when you finished later on, you were in the military and you finished, and then kind of started playing D&D games with these people and tabletop gaming, and how did that lead to you getting work at Origin Systems then?
Yeah, so, my first D&D game was the night of my 11th birthday at winter camp with scouts. So I had a very classic 80s, like if you ever seen the movie Meatballs, I had that classic 80s experience. But yeah, the military, the way you escape a small town like that sometimes is like if you don't have any options and you don't have a criminal record and you know, you can pass a couple of simple tests and you're physically whole. I guess there's some privilege in there, but like it was easy for me to jump into the Air Force. And so I had this grand experience living in Germany for 3 years, traveling to Saudi Arabia between the Gulf Wars. I was in during Desert Storm. And of course, in the military, it's a lot of young dudes. There's a lot of women too, but like, there's a lot of men. And so it's very male culture, right? Wherever a base pops up, there's a lot of like, you know, complications because, oh my God, suddenly 10,000 20-year-old men are living here now. But one of the upsides is, people played a lot of video games and played a lot of D&D. And so we did a lot of that in, I remember being part of the first Special Operations Comm Squadron, and we had these Swan laptops that I've talked about where they were all ridiculously expensive because they had been tested at altitude and they could survive being dropped and all this other stuff. But in any case, we all played like Rogue on them or Wolfenstein. You know,
I love that.
And,
you know, in your spare time, you just fire up Wolfenstein on these expensive machines.
When I was in Dhahran, I maintained and operated a radio room. It was like a airport that gave us a little portion of while we were enforcing a no-fly parallel for Saddam Hussein, you know. And I worked the night shift, you know, and it's 12-hour shifts. You know, you drive through the desert from your little base, Khobar Towers. I remember one of these formative moments for me was like, I knew nothing. I was a kid from a small town with a blue collar background. And I left Khobar Towers, you know, one evening to go to work and like driving through the desert, get to the base, get on the base, drive through this more desert, right, to get to the actual airstrip where our radio room was. And there's like this train crossing kind of thing in front of the road and a bunch of hangars far off to the left, like hundreds of meters away. And I had to stop. The bars came down and it was all clanging and I couldn't believe it. I didn't even think about it ever stopping me because I'd driven past it a bunch of times. And all these British Tornadoes, the planes were taxiing from those hangars to the runway, and they all went by one at a time. And one of the pilots turned and looked at me and saluted, you know, and I saluted him back. And it was like, I was just thinking, like, what am I doing here? If they find out that I know nothing about anything, I had been trained to operate the radios and to maintain them and all that, but like, it was satellite communication equipment, but still, it was like, wow, this is so weird. But anyway, the reason I belabor this point is everybody there was very lonely. They were lonely for their families, for their hometowns. It's kind of boring to you know, live on some makeshift base in the desert while you do something that someone else thinks is important for a few months or whatever. But we had a PC in the radio room, and pilots would come in after their sorties or getting there, and they would be like, you know, not ready to go to bed yet. They would swing by. A couple of these guys would swing by the radio room and say, "Hey, can I play a little SimCity?" Because that's what we had installed on the machine. And everybody had a save game of their hometown, like as some megapolis, right? And I would sit and talk to these guys and watch them play SimCity, named after their hometown or whatever. And it's just like games have always been a part of human society and probably predates, you know, of course, many forms of media, all the other media, I guess. But it was just kind of magical, you know? And so that period of time, we played a lot of games. I had an Amiga and an Atari 1040 ST, and the Amiga had a cable at the time that you could just plug two Amigas together and play networked games. So the very first multiplayer, first-person perspective game I played was probably MIDI Maze on the Amiga and or on the Atari 1040 ST. And also there were flight sims. So we would bring those to work at night. I always preferred the night shift because you didn't have to deal with the military bureaucracy or the officers or whatever. And we would put them all in the counter. You know, all we were there for is to monitor the equipment. And if alarms went off, to fix the equipment. And it almost never went off, right? You know, was 99 point something % of the time on air. And we'd sit there and play games all night, you know. And I remember, this is crazy. I remember like we would get these equipment parts, and they would come with these, imagine something roughly the size of a snowboard, but a little thicker. And it was made of this very, very resilient plastic foam. And so one night we had a pipe running through the middle of the compound at about, I don't know, 7 feet in height or 6 feet in height. And I took one of those and cut a hole in it for a handle. And I was out there like knocking the hacky sack back and forth over that pipe, because we had a hacky sack. You know what that is? We kick it around, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
and
sure. California Games taught us
yes.
that.
Yeah.
And it started a tournament at our satellite communications shop where everybody made themselves a paddle out of the styrofoam stuff that we had. And we kept score on the whiteboard and all that. And so it's just like my fond memory of like, we got in trouble one night. Some general called because his daughter called our boss because his daughter couldn't sleep because their house was like a quarter mile away. And we were yelling and screaming in the middle of the night, playing this crazy game with these foam paddles and this hacky sack over this pipe out in the gravel pit in front of the SATCOM van that we worked in. But anyways, games have always been a part of everyone's life, right? If you're lucky. And so while I was in the military, unless I'm mistaken, that's when Thief 1 came out, Thief, The Dark Project. And maybe that's when Underworld came out. And I remember playing both and just being like, and those were, of course, were one project apart from each other. I don't know how much, 1 or 2 projects apart, like, cause there's also an Underworld 2. And I might have picked up Underworld late, but whatever. I remember playing both of those games. And, at the time, I think I had moved to Florida or something. And, for my last assignment in the military, and Underworld was like, finally, this is the thing. You know, because it took the sort of recombinant pieces of adventure and the first-person perspective exploration of those games, like, you know, you name it, like whatever first-person exploration game you want to, even the super early proto ones, and then it mixed it with a D&D wrapper, and it was just like, oh my God, I could live here, I could explore this. There were games before that, like Dungeon Master in 1987. That was like, I just played and played and played and played and played. I played it until when you go to sleep at night after like a snow skiing trip or water skiing, and when you close your eyes and you're drifting off, you have that sense of motion. People who have been snow skiing talk about that, you know, like I used to go to sleep at night and I would have that one square at a time going fast thing from Dungeon Master, you know, one tile at a time. Like, but anyway, Underworld just rocked my world. And when I got out of the military, one of my friends, D&D player, high school buddy, still work with him. He worked on Deus Ex, Dishonored, Prey. He worked on the Ultima games. You should talk to him. In fact, he worked on Ultima 7, Black Gate, and Serpent Isle. His name's Steve Powers. But he had followed another friend of ours, and Billy Kane, the three of us, all from Freeport, this tiny town. And all three worked in video games. But Billy had started a band called Culture Shock, and they moved to Austin in the early 90s. And so Steve just moved and lived on his couch and helped with the band. And when I got out of the Air Force, he was like, when I was getting out of the Air Force, they come to you and they say, okay, you've decided not to re-enlist. Therefore, we're separating you on this date. And it's like, what, really? And it's practically anywhere. And so I gave him an address in Austin. I had to go get an apartment and stuff, but I had to decide where to move is the point. Do I go home? Do I go to one of the base, you know, the cities where I lived? And Steve was like, dude, you should come to Austin. You love Austin when you used to visit it. We're here now. And, you know, and so I moved to Austin just kind of almost on a whim because this was one of my best friends. And, when I got there, I spent 6 months unemployed, just like not quite knowing what to do. I did a bunch of writing. I did a bunch of gaming, and Steve kept saying, you should come work at Origin. And I was like, dude, I don't know how to make video games. And he would point out, well, like, you play more video games than anyone I know, and you never stop deconstructing them. And you play and make a lot of RPG content. And so he said, you'd be instantly not at the bottom of the pack and not at the top of the pack, because you'd have to learn some technology too. But if you came to be a level designer or game designer or whatever, and at the time there was no level design, it was just the title I've mentioned before, but the title was technical design assistant, I think. But in any case, I couldn't see it for myself, you know? And, but I started trying to apply for positions, and, you know, I got rejected over and over. But I was on the softball team, the company softball team. I played Shadowrun and D&D on different nights in the conference rooms, the meeting rooms, with people that worked there. One time, Richard Garriott took everybody skydiving, and I went with them to San Marcos and jumped out of a plane from 9,500 feet or whatever it was. And it's kind of stunning. I'd never done it before, but like literally no one in our group missed the like 3-meter gravel circle. That's how good modern parachutes are. You pull down on one side or the other side, or pull on both and slow, and everybody would just gently set down in this like little circle of gravel. But, you know, after all that, I still hadn't gotten a job at the company as a designer or a writer. And so the best thing possible happened. I applied for a QA position and got it. It was like $7 an hour, a folding table in the back of the room, not even a computer. I had a 3DO and a clipboard. And my boss was this lady, Kay Gilmore, who really just gave me my shot, you know. And it was the best thing that could have happened, because I worked in QA. You work with the programmers, the artists, the marketing people, the translations people.
You get to know everyone, yeah.
You get to know everybody, yeah. And so, I told all the guys in the softball team and stuff, hey, I finally got a job at Origin. And they all were like, you don't work at Origin. You come up there like 3 nights a week. You're in the meeting rooms playing games with us. We talk about our projects in front of you. Like, what do you mean you don't work there? You've been around for 6 months or whatever. And I was like, yeah, I know. I finally get a job, you know. So, but anyway, that was the beginning of so far 31 years of working in games with That's these incredible. Amazing people, you know, many of whom are still my friends, and so many early experiences happened. I was only at Origin like 3 years, which at the time it seemed like forever, you know. And then I went on to another company for 1.5 years on Fireteam and left. And then I was at IonStorm for 6 years, and I was like, wow, Origin still feels like my formative thing. But wow, 6 years is a long time. And like, you know, I've changed companies a few times, but I was at Arcane for 16 years. So every time I'm at someplace longer, I look back, but Origin stays somehow a very formative experience. It was like going to summer camp for the first time, where you're surrounded by all these people who have all this in common with you. You know, whether they're deep into Star Trek or Doctor Who at the time, or some of them were in the SCA. They would go out on the weekends and fight with wooden swords and stuff. And there were history majors. And then on the technology side, amazing technologists. And on the art side, amazing artists. And suddenly all the musicians, the producers, you know, like just all these different people, like doing sound Foley work or whatever. And it's like, when you have a background like mine, you don't even know what that is until you encounter it. And suddenly I was around all these people that are out in the parking lot breaking celery so they could make bone crunching noises or work or whatever. And it was magical, you know, and it was also terrible, right? Like we had an old school punch clock where you'd stick it in the hole and you'd hear cha-chunk, and it would like print the number of hours you had worked. And I literally clocked 100-hour weeks sometimes. And I remember telling my French coworkers that when I was living in Lyon, and they were like, how is it possible? How would you have time to live your life? And I was like, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, this is my life.
Yeah, exactly. It was horrible. I resented it and left angry, and you know, I don't work like that anymore, right? But like, I learned so much and I had so much fun.
Well, one thing I'm interested to hear a bit more about, because obviously when you were doing that, you know, the early days in QA there, one of the titles that you worked on that Ravi mentioned at the start was Super Wing Commander on the 3DO, which was a kind of a souped up version of Wing Commander that came out a few years earlier. I'm interested in the 3DO. do you remember when you first saw it, and what did you think of that system?
Yeah, so I wasn't like, it's funny, people in games, depending on what your sort of ancestral line is, right? Like I was somebody who had an Atari 2600, played arcade games, and then branched into Amiga, which had sound and better graphics, and Atari 1040 ST, but eventually also played on the PC. And I just never was like, early on, I never was a console guy. There were all these Japanese games that people played that I didn't even know what they were at the time. And of course, over the years, I've caught up, like I've played my share of Pokemon and I love the PlayStation, etc. But so I didn't really have much, like I remember people thought it was really hot because, it had like, I might get all this wrong now because I'm reaching back 30 years or whatever, but like, I think there was a big deal about the CD that it had at the time and the controllers. And, I got that job, I think, because I had pirated Wing Commander 1 and 2. And so I already knew all the missions. And basically they needed someone to fly the missions, point out quality of life things for the player, find ways to reproduce bugs so the programmers could quickly squash the bugs. Or that was just one of the pieces of technology we had. One of those projects I worked in, like, I don't know what year it was, 94 or something. I had two VR systems on my desk, right? So we always had hardware in to run our games on. And, whether it was a special version of the game like Super Wing Commander 3DO, or it was just something that was being adapted like System Shock to the two VR headsets. I'll tell you a 3DO story though that you might like. One of the games in there, and that it was a secret missions packaged with Wing 1 and 2, I think. And it was like a good bundle if you were a Wing Commander fan, right? But and this was like while Chris Roberts and his team were working on Wing 3. So they called us to the cafeteria one day, shuttered the windows, and they showed us on a big TV on a cart, Wing 3. And it was just simply a tech demo of the dogfighting against Kilrathi ships, but it had 3D models flying around with a lighting model so that as the ships banked and turned, the lighting would play across the facets. And that's nothing now, but I tell you, everyone in the room was stunned at the time. And so like, we went from these 2D sprites that flipped. I don't remember how many positions they had, but like you could see the ships flipping, right? Because they only had like, 8 facings or whatever. But anyway, we would sit there and play these missions and write them up and try to reproduce the bugs. Like, oh, we're having a crash, make it crash. Tell us exactly what the 3 steps to make it crash are, and then the programmer can find it very easily. But the missions, some of them are about the Kilrathi developing. The Kilrathi are, of course, lion aliens, like from the novel The Manzin Wars or something. But the part of the plot is about the Kilrathi developing cloaking technology. And I remember we were playing this mission one time, and one of the Kilrathi ships went invisible, and I was chasing it. And you could only see when they fired their weapons, the sprites that had what we would now call VFX on them for the blasters moving through space. You could see those, and the afterburners, the jets, when they came on, you could see those. But otherwise the ship was invisible. And I remember dogfighting and chasing one. And one of the producers was standing around, and he looked over and he was like, "What the hell are you doing? What's going on?" And I was just like, "I'm just playing the game. I'm trying to get this one thing to reproduce." And he was just stunned, and he called his programmer friend over, and they were freaking out. And finally the programmer was like, "What is it you think is happening right now?" And I was like, "Well, I'm chasing this Kilrathi ship, and it cloaked and blah, 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 because the game's about cloaking." And he was like, "No, it's just not drawing the ship. How are you guys playing this game if it doesn't draw the enemy ships?" And QA, you get super good at games, right? You memorize the floor plan of everything, right? And so I was like, "I'm just dogfighting this invisible ship, but I can see when the afterburners turn on and when the blasters fire. And the programmer, this was like a life lesson moment. Like you know, if you could look back over your life and you could track the like, how many times did something happen that was like lit your brain up, right? And he said, you know, every action sphere in Wing Commander is allowed a certain number of ships, a certain amount of art. And so you fly from one action sphere to another. There may be another ship fighting you there, but you're not allowed to have all three in the first action sphere. You can maybe only have two plus your own ship and whatever. And so what has happened here is we've exceeded the amount of art that we can have in this action sphere. So it's literally just not drawing the ship. And the reason the blasters and the afterburners come on is those are shared between all the ships. And I remember just my brain just going like, as a non-engineer, my brain just going, oh, wow, that explains a lot. That's what's going on here. And what had happened was there was an assert somewhere in the code where like, if you ever exceed the memory in an action sphere, assert, you know, crash, and then give this little report so that somebody can go figure out what's going on. And a programmer assigned with the bug for it being, you know, crashing had just turned that assert off. And so, which is not a very responsible way to fix that bug. But like what it meant was like we were fighting these invisible ships in Wing Commander 3DO and the programmers were delighted. And so,
I love that.
Yeah, but because it was about cloaking, and because process was not as organized, like modern QA people are geniuses. The sort of process they have for checklisting and making sure on 27 languages everything works and on multiple platforms and all, you know. But in any case, that's my Wing Commander 3DO story.
Well, it's interesting because you went on to System Shock, and System Shock is a great title. It also has a lot of kind of familiar themes that go into Deus Ex, just in the idea of design, and also as a like a first person shooter as well, with lots of different elements like hacking in there and stuff. It was quite a complex game for the time as well. What were your memories of getting on that project?
Because Underworld was not just a game to me. You know, there's video games that I like I liked Wing Commander. And then there's things like Underworld or Dungeon Master or Thief, that were like the only way I can explain it to people. I mean, you guys will get it, of course, but like when I'm talking to non-game people, I say, you know how you like music, but then there was that one album. If you're pretentious and you went through the 90s, it was probably Radiohead or something. And I say that as a huge Radiohead fan, where it's not just music. It is life-changing. When I was a kid, it was people into Pink Floyd. It was like, this was something so above and beyond music. It just changed my life, and I listened to it over and over. In that same sense, Underworld was like that for me. And, you know, there were other titles too, like Doom and Thief and even Half-Life, of course, you know, just lots of brilliant, life-changing, amazing games. And they continue to be, you know, like at some point it was Far Cry 2. Most recently it was Elden Ring. Just where like, at one point it was Red Dead Redemption 1. Just like, I feel like that my friends lose me for a month because I just dive into it. And otherwise I have to, this is like a guilty admission. I don't really care that much about most video games because they don't do it for me. Yeah. And I will look at them and, oh, they're doing this well, and this is beautiful. And, oh, they figured out a new way to do this UI thing. That's cool. But it's not the lightning in a bottle experience that Underworld was for me, or Dungeon Master, or Adventure on the Atari 2600. And every time I mention that game, I wonder if Warren Robinett is still alive and could I meet him somehow, you know, that kind of thing. But I looked over this guy's shoulder in QA, and he was playing something. And he wasn't really assigned to it yet. It had come into test, and he was like, got it working on a machine, and immediately beelined over because I recognized something in it. And I was like, dude, what is that? And he said, "Oh, it's called Citadel. It's from Blue Sky, or I don't know if they were called Looking Glass yet, but it's the people that worked with us on Underworld that made Underworld." And I was like, immediately went to my boss's office, and we were laughing and talking all the time. She had been around longer and was a very good manager and ran QA and customer service at Origin. So she was like super strong. So I knew I could say anything to her. I walked in her office and I was like, "Hey, who do I have to kill for you to get on this project?" And she knew the job that I had done on Wing Commander and the things developers were saying about me. I was already people were trying to recruit me into their teams. And she had told me, "You're eventually going to get recruited into the team, one of the teams, but you're going to stay with me for a year. You have to stay for 1 year. Otherwise, the turnover of really good people is too high." And around that time, there were all these people like Dan Orslak, who eventually went on to work on the Halo games, who was in QA, Star Long, who eventually went on to be the main guy on Ultima Online. Mark Vitek was in QA and he did Crusader. And there were all these people that came out of QA at the time. It was like a farm team. And so she said, early on, she had said, "You have to stay here 1 year." And she said, "You don't have to kill anybody. Nobody's on that. And it's a buggy mess." And she said to me, she said this thing, she stopped and she said, I don't think I've ever told anyone this because it's mildly embarrassing.
Right.
She said, in a way, back to Meatballs, back to summer camp and those magical early experiences. She said, "Oh, you know what? The guy on that, Doug, you're going to love Doug Church." And I was like, cool. I just want to work on the game. And so I started working I got a little team, and we were on it for 10 months. The floppy version, was brilliant. And then they gave us the CD one day. And it had voices. It had Shodan's voice and all these sound effects that weren't and it elevated the audio logs, went from being a cool thing that you read, like a note in Underworld, to being like brilliant, just like you hear guns being shot in the background and you hear like mutants running at the force field wall, and the last ditch effort of this engineering team on Citadel trying to get to the airlock or whatever, as they, this is the last message of this guy. I get goosebumps talking about it now. And I'm friends with people like Austin Grossman, who wrote a bunch of that. And, a lot of other people I could name too, but anyway, we were on that for 10 months. I wasn't the lead the whole time. At first I was just a tester on it. But then the lead left and I took over, and then we finished the project, and then we did the CD version. And the last month or so, I think I got to meet all those guys because they were coming down from Boston all the time, a few of them. And the last month or so, Doug Church and a guy, I think James Fleming, a rendering guy, sat in like our big cubicle area, right? And it was like boot camp for video games, because those guys had not only worked on games for years, they literally, some of them, Doug, had worked at DARPA, right? Early on. So gone to MIT. It was just in their blood to know software engineering and game design and all that. And I just leveled up so much with those guys. I owe them everything. Rob Fermier, Art Min, Tim Stelmach, all these people. And they did such brilliant work. Mark LeBlanc, if you just look at Underworld, System Shock, and Thief, if somebody only ever did those three things, that is a genius career.
Yeah.
And the sad thing about many video games, especially I like things like the Retro Hour, is that people don't even know that, right? Shigeru Miyamoto is deservedly famous for all that he's done. But overall in this little niche, games that I prefer actually are done by people that no one even knows, right? Yeah. And so it's a weird thing. I don't know, what's the best example? Brandon Sanderson, isn't that the guy that writes all the modern fantasy stuff? Sells bajillions of copies, but maybe not as many people read Ursula K. Le Guin or Michael Moorcock, and it's just the way of the world, right? But so I was lucky enough. The point of this is not to grumble. The point of this is that I was lucky enough to be in a spot where my version of Tolkien or whatever was making games with us right there. You know, the guys at Looking Glass, the people at that company. And it was, well, to say it was life-changing is an understatement. Like you said, it was cyberpunk, and it was an homage to all the science fiction that had come before. It's full of allusions to beloved science fiction, which is maybe something modern players don't know or whatever. I don't know. But like the reason all the immersive sim companies start their games with a door pad code that has 0451 is that System Shock did that. And that was an allusion to Fahrenheit 451, right? And so, yeah, it was just brilliant. It was games as literature. It was video games as Dungeons and Dragons. And of course it was cyberpunk material. And we riffed on that for Deus Ex, of course. And
well, I was interested in that. I mean, how did System Shock kind of lay the foundations for Deus Ex then? And, obviously creating an FPS.
Yeah. I mean, like hugely fundamental, like Warren, of course, was the exec producer, I think, on, both of those games, and the director of Deus Ex. And so, it was in his wheelhouse as well. He loved those games too. Having worked on Underworld and having worked on System Shock and Thief. And so, the idea of a first person role-playing game where you didn't have a party, was something that had been done. Before that, Dungeon Master had a party, but it was a first-person role-playing game, and so it was more immersive to some of us, I think, because you could kind of you would watch people playing, and you would see them leaning in their chairs, trying to see around the corner. And of course, that doesn't do anything. That's not how that works, right? But they're looking down a hallway, and they're literally leaning to one side in their chair to try to see around the corner. And it's like there's something powerful that for some of us that just hijacks the brain and says you're looking at the scene from first person. You're not looking at the map from up in the air like a drone, or but anyway, I would say that the resource management and the object density and a lot of the first person tricks, it was absolutely foundational. If there wasn't an Underworld or a System Shock or a Thief or a Half-Life, Deus Ex wouldn't have been the same game.
And I think with Deus Ex, the choice of play styles as well, and also how the world kind of changed depending on your behavior was really revolutionary at the time, especially with an FPS.
Yeah, that was a big goal of ours, was a sort of Ultima style moral decisions. And how characters would react. I worked on a lot. I was a level designer. I got a little more technical as I worked, right? I was a level designer for a few projects, and Deus Ex was one of them where I probably worked on 60% of the levels in the game, because I did all mine and ended up taking over some from another person, from two people actually. And, but New York, Liberty Island was one of the ones I did. And it was very daunting because it was the opening of the game, and we had to set the tone for what we were. And there were arguments on the team about whether we were just going to be like Doom or whether we were going to be a big Ultima role-playing game. And then a faction of us were like, no, this game is like Underworld with guns. That's what I said to Warren, And we were kind of looking at all three factions, like which one's going to win out, right? And by building the first level, I was like, okay, there's a stealth component here. There's a lot of side passages, alternate routes. There's a lot of stuff that you can just go discover. There's a moral choice. If you kill everybody all the way up to the top, your brother comes down and calls you a jackass, or comes out and calls you a jackass. He says those were people, and that was pretty revolutionary for a game. Our writer, Sheldon Bacody, was so brilliant, and a line that we all loved was related to whether a group is called terrorist or freedom fighters, depending on what the government needs at the moment, right? And of course, Reagan is famous for doing that, right? Like one time we're funding these guys and they're freedom fighters, and then later we call them terrorists or whatever. And so all of that was in the mix. It was a little bit James Bond, a little bit geopolitics, a little bit X-Files, a little bit Underworld with guns. But I remember building those areas, and part of why it worked, this is something Rafael Colantonio and I say all the time, that your team needs young people on it because they don't know yet what's possible and not possible. And veterans go, well, we tried that, it doesn't work. Or if you do this too late, the localization people freak out, so we shouldn't do that. But like, people who have not done anything yet, there's a kind of there's probably a great quote on this from somebody because it probably translates to other fields as well. But there's a power in ignorance. And I had that power. And so I remember building that island, and I had never been to New York. I've still never been to Liberty Island, unfortunately. There's a funny story. At one point, I had a book open on my desk for months, and it had the base of the Statue of Liberty. And I had another book open on the other end of my desk. We all had like these double desks with 3 monitors and all that. And at one point, I was having trouble with this star-shaped building, getting it to line up with this base that the statue stands on and all that. And I realized that one book was a photo from like the earliest days of the Statue of Liberty, before it had another piece added to this big star-shaped building or whatever. If you look at the very early photos of it, and I was trying to match the things I had built from one image and the things from the other image. And of course it didn't line up or whatever, but like, so I built that, and then I was like, okay, I'm going to add a dungeon in the back, a side encounter, right? So there's an area with like a sparking electrical thing, and you can get some resources back there. And of course, off the north dock, you start on the south dock, and Paul's there. He offers you which weapon. And if you choose the non-lethal one, he kind of compliments you. But on the north dock, I took the barge that we built for another part of the game, and I sunk it under the water. And I timed this. If you blew the hatch up and swam down there and went into the hold, you could get stuff out just in time without taking damage if you had the swim skill or whatever, right? And so, like, okay, if you don't have the swim skill or the aqua lung or any explosives to blow the hatch, you might have to take multiple trips. You might take a little drowning damage or whatever. But if you have all that, it will reward you because you'll be able to go down, open up the hatch, get in there, get the stuff, turn on your light, collect some resources, swim back out. And so if you go to that north dock, there's a barge or a ship sunk under the water there. And that was us trying to, we had a mandate to we had worked out as a team, like every level, try to pay off what choices the players made. If they're trying not to kill everybody, if they've taken aqua lung, for God's sake, we had swimming levels, right? And if you wanted to look through cameras and take over bots and take over turrets and use those to fight your enemies.
I think you could smash through doors as well, couldn't you?
If you built your strength up, you could smash through doors, you could pick up vending machines, and you could get all the way to the top and talk to the, I can't remember what the group's called, NSF, which is like the National Science Foundation. My friend Mark LeBlanc was just like, I feel like this is a bad acronym for you,
I think that's, a huge part of the immersion. And another part of it as well was the soundtrack as well. It was Alexander Brandon, and he'd done stuff from Unreal Tournament as well previously. So it had that kind of FPS-y feel. I remember he used to use trackers as well when he was creating the music. I'm not sure if he did in Deus Ex, but it was a fabulous soundtrack.
Yeah, we've gotten so much positivity off of that work that he did, and really have to hand it to him. I think during the time, he was a super sweet guy, but at the time, I think we butted heads a lot, but it wasn't professional. It was just like there were different factions on the team, and I kind of regret that because the work is certainly good. He did great work, and everybody loves that music, and I love it, so... but yeah, I remember out back of UNATCO, I built a compound with a little satellite communications van, and it's literally the van I was telling you about earlier. Just outside, we had that pipe, and we would knock the hacky sack back and forth across, over that pipe, and made that little game up. All those little spur dungeons, like the sunken barge and the little area out back with the electrical stuff, and the SATCOM van, all that was elective content. It was unneeded. And so I feel like that was another thing that probably just goes under the radar now, because all games have that, right? If you play any open world game. But at the time, it was like we were literally trying to approach this game as dungeon masters. This is, if I set up an encounter, you had to go to a farm. There wouldn't just be the farm that you have to go to. There would be a ruined building at the edge of the property and, whatever, something off in the woods with smoke rising from it. Just things to try to draw you off course, right? And it's in making those decisions, as you say, it's part of what makes it immersive. And we learned that, of course, from Dungeons and Dragons, and we learned it from Ultima. I did have a funny Ultima story, by the way, since you guys interviewed Richard, who I love. And he was very important for me, the way Warren was, the way Doug Church was. But I was a hothead back then, and I was not the sort of more polished person than I am now. I made lots of friends deeply, and I made lots of enemies as well at the time. I think it's, part of being a young person with ambition and who hasn't worked out your trauma yet or whatever. But anyway, Ultima 8 came out, and I was such a huge fan of Ultima 7 and Ultima 7 Serpent Isle. And Ultima 8 just deeply offended me. It had this weird jumping system where it was very easy to fail jumps, and then you would fall in the water and die, and the reload times were like crazy. And people had done things on the team like, it's an isometric view, so you can't see behind a tree, but you can run behind a tree. People had hidden like fire mushrooms behind trees, so you would run behind a tree, moving left to right on the screen. You'd hear a boom, and the avatar would die, and it would take you like 3 minutes to reload or whatever. And it was just like, I could list literally 100 things wrong with it. And so I wrote this letter to Kay. I don't know why I did this, but I wrote down like 99 things wrong with the game and raged. And I sent it off to her, my boss. And it was the only thing I could do, because I could always vent to Kay, and it was always safe and cool. She had good judgment around all this stuff. And I was like, this game is an insult to Ultima fans. The graphics are muddy because they tried to go high res and they didn't quite have it figured out yet. They tried to go 3D. They didn't have it figured out yet. They're influenced by Mario 64, but they're not that game lineage. So the jumping sucks. And it just, everything that was cool about Blackgate and Serpent Isle is half done in this game. And so I wrote this report, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. And I listed like literally 199 things, 99 or 100 things. And one day I'm sitting at my cubicle working, and this shadow falls over me, and the desk kind of creaks. And I look up to the left, and, Richard would come through QA once in a while, Lord British, with a cart full of ice cream or pizza for crunching or whatever. And he would sometimes talk to us, and he's a magnetic guy. He's very charismatic. And he was on fire at the time for Origin and for video games and all of that. And I look up, and Richard's sitting there leaning on the desk, and he's holding this stack of papers that he had printed out. And it's my list of 100 things and calling it an insult to gamers and all. And I remember thinking, I'm about to get fired. This was a cool job. And he said, hey, I got this. Kay knew how he would respond to it, so she had given it to him. And he said, I got this, and I've been looking it over, and I agree with everything on it. And I was like, oh, okay, thank God. And then he said, how would you like to fix these things?
Wow.
And I was like, I would like very much to fix those things, and he's like, I'm going to give you, there's a programmer or two and a designer or two that are between projects, and they want to fix these things too. And they thought they were a little burned. Honestly, he left that part out, but they want to fix these things. They thought this was an insightful list. And so we did not fix everything, but we fixed more than half of it. I think we made the targeted jumping. This guy, Mike McShaffrey, had a good idea for how to fix that. And, we simplified that, and we made the game deep in other places. And the reason they were doing this is the CD was coming out, and the DLC had elemental entities in it that had voices with processing, the way the way Shodan had processing on their voice and all that. And so, long story short, we re-released the game with the CD and the voice files and all these fixes, and it got re-reviewed by Scorpia. I don't know if you remember the sort of famously acerbic video game reviewer of the time. And I was very proud of that. Even it didn't make it the greatest game ever, but it was an example of like acting and seeing your actions on the world and making the world a better place, and not caring about rocking the boat, but doing it anyway. And my boss supported me and protected me and didn't let anything bad happen to me. And Richard had the wisdom to not see this as an insult, but instead see it as an opportunity. And so Origin was a crazy place. Like, something bad can happen to you one day, and the next day something great could happen.
I love that. You know, I think it's been a really interesting interview. When I first contacted you, Harvey, you were like, retro. What do you want to kind of talk about? And I think, it's really nice kind of, you know, obviously you've had an absolutely amazing career with Arcane, and Dishonored is just a masterpiece, and it's great to see all those fantastic titles coming out as well. I'm just really glad to talk to you about, you know, those early days. And I was just wondering, finally, before we wrap the interview up, what are you kind of up to today?
Yeah, so, you know, I was with Arcane for 16 years. I worked for most of that in the Austin office, 4 of it in the lovely Lyon office. Love the people there. Had so many good friends at ZeniMax. Such a good experience overall. And, you know, we did Deus Ex 1 and 2 and Death of the Outsider during that time. And I'm super proud of those games and the teams that made them. And, you know, while I was working on Deus Ex 2, I'm sorry, I keep saying Deus Ex 2, Dishonored 2. While I was working on Dishonored 1 and 2, Raph and I worked on Dishonored 1 together with the team spread across Lyon and Austin. But then for Dishonored 2, I went to Lyon and worked with those guys, and Raph took the team in Austin and he worked on Prey with Ricardo. And then also Death of the Outsider happened in there. And so during that run where we really had it together and everything was going well, if you just look at what the 2 offices did, you know, Dishonored 1, Dishonored 2, Prey, Death of the Outsider, Deathloop, it's a pretty amazing run, I think, and very passion driven. We had the sort of sensibilities of a passion driven indie group and the power of a large group because we're being funded by ZeniMax, you know. And so last year, you know, we got shut down, Arcane Austin, and everybody's in the wind or getting another job or whatever. And so, you know, I have been putting things together on my end, and my hope is to get a studio off the ground soon.
Nice.
That'd be awesome to see. Yeah. Because,
and my dream is to make more immersive sims, you know. I feel like after 31 years, I really feel like I know what's important to me now, you know, in a way, because I can look back on everything. And I know how important those early people were to me. And so I've tried to be a mentor. There's so many people I've hired out of college who have gone on to make amazing things, you know. I talked to my friend Seth Shane not long ago, and he worked with us on Dishonored. He came out of Carnegie Mellon. He had done some indie stuff, but he worked on his first big game was Dishonored, which was mind blowing. And then he went on to work on Destiny and just like super sharp guys. There's all these people that I treasure my relationships with them because we've made these games together, you know. And so I just want to do that again, you know. That's just and when you're doing it, you have to be a little aware, if you've been around a long time, that you're maybe once in a while lighting somebody else up the way Doug Church or, you know, any number of other people, Warren Spector certainly lit me up, you know, and changed my life. That is what it's all about for me.
Well, what a great place to end there, Harvey. That's an incredible story. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing some of your memories. And best of luck in your next step. Can't wait to see what you do next.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me.